Okay, thank you, Mairead. You're all very welcome to this session. It's called Generation 20%. What is it about? It's all about buying a house. And I'm looking down, and a lot of you are very young, and buying a house is the furthest thing off your mind. But someday you will get to that stage where you'll think about buying a house, where you're going to leave the nest and make that big step. Why did we call it Generation 20%? Well, it's got to do with mortgage lending. And I'm not sure if you're aware, but in January last year, the central bank introduced new rules with regard to mortgage lending. And for a lot of people, you are now going to have to come up with a 20% deposit. Just in context, when I bought my house 12 years ago, I had to come up with a 10% deposit, and a lot of people now will have to come up with 20%. But for first-time buyers, there's a little concession, and that concession is that you have to come up with 10% deposit up to a value of 220,000. Beyond that, or in excess of that, you have to come up with 20%. They also placed a limit on your income, and what that means is they placed a limit of 3.5 times your gross annual income as your maximal mortgage. So in other words, they would accept 3.5 times your salary. Back in my day, 12 years ago, there was some crazy prices going, or crazy figures. They probably accepted maybe up to 5 or 6 times your salary. So things have changed, things have tightened. So what does that mean? I've given you kind of the rules. What does it mean? Okay, you go out there in the morning and you look at a house and it's worth 250,000. You're going to have to come up with a deposit. As a first-time buyer, you're going to come up with a deposit of 28,000 euro. We'll increase it another bit. If you see a house worth 300,000, you're going to have to come up with 38,000 euro. And go again. If you have a house worth 350,000, you're going to have to come up with 48,000 euro in deposit. So every increase of 50% in the cost of the house, you're going to have to come up with 10,000 euro more in deposit. Okay, so if you think about it, you're all very young. You're only starting out on your careers. Maybe some of you have been working for a number of years and you're interested in getting on the property ladder. You know, how do you do it? Even at 250,000, how do you come up with a 28,000 euro deposit for a house? You're probably renting at the moment. Maybe you bought a car, maybe you haven't. You have to support that. You have to live, you have to eat, you have to clothe yourself. You know, how do you come up with that level of a deposit? It's not easy. So today I have a panel, and we're going to talk through some of the options that are, you know, might be attractive options, maybe a little bit different way of thinking on how to maybe manage that. And I'm going to introduce my panel. To my left here, I have Ciara. Ciara Leahy works with us in Irish Country Living with the Irish Farmers Journal. And Ciara is going to tell us her story in a little while. She's a prospective house buyer. I'm also joined by Tom Dunne from the School of Surveying and Construction Management in DIT. And Tom is going to display or outline to us maybe some changes in behavioural patterns. And I'm also joined by Healy Hynes from Real Estate Alliance Hynes in Athlone. Real Estate Alliance is a property network scattered throughout the country, so they have a number of offices all over the country. And I suppose, Tom, I'm going to start with you because everybody just wants to know where we are at the moment with the market. Since the peak to trough, house prices have dropped by, on average, maybe 70% down to trough. They've since recovered. Just give an overview of where we are at the moment and where the market is at.
Okay, thanks, Shirley. I think the best way of thinking of that is that if you were back in 2005 and you paid 100,000 euro for a house, by 2012 it would have fallen to 50,000, and it's probably back up to 65, 70,000 now. In the Dublin area, in the rest of the outside the Dublin area, it's probably not back up to anywhere near that, but it is beginning to grow. And what's happening now in the Dublin area is that they've probably peaked out and house prices have stopped growing, limited by the inability of people to pay, obviously, and that's limited by the central bank rules. But I don't think that's the whole story. I think there's a bigger background to that, which we might discuss.
Okay. Healy, if I just come to you a minute, just Real Estate Alliance, they issue various surveys throughout the year. And just this particular survey, it was in our Agri career supplement last week. Unfortunately, we can't put it on the screen just due to technical error. But Healy, there's a lot of value out there. If I just relate to some figures here,
Sure.
The average, say, for Leash, for a 3-bed semi, 120,000. In Carlow, 142,000. Kilkenny, 145,000. You know, it just seems to me, in my time 12 years ago, you couldn't hardly get a half-acre site for 140,000 and then build. You know, is it a good time to buy?
In the current market, once you get outside the greater Dublin Pale area, the values drop significantly. The value that can be got in the regional centres is definitely far more attractive than it would be from people who are inside in Dublin and those kind of districts. Even the areas that you've mentioned, if you go to smaller counties, smaller towns, the values get even greater. Areas that would have seen large elements of supply driven by Section 23 allowances, for example, Longford, North Roscommon, places like that would have even greater value to be got, and you would be getting apartments in town centres for well south of €100,000 in many of these places.
I just noticed there in the survey, Healy, which I thought was quite interesting, and no disrespect to Mayo, but the average price for a 3-bed semi, 195,000, and the same with Kerry, the average price in Kerry, 177,000, well above the Kilkenny, the Laois and the Carlows.
Yeah.
Why is that, Healy?
So supply and demand, a lot of the supply side is been driven by stressed vendors. The level of borrowings that are out there relative to the values that are being attained in the marketplace, many of the vendors are in negative equity situations. They've got mortgages that are higher than the values of what are there. They're not in a position to sell. So those that are selling are selling because they either have smaller mortgages or they're being driven by creditors to move the properties back on again. Those kind of areas that you're speaking would have less supply coming on. They would be more affluent type of towns, Killarney, for example. So that would necessitate that the supply side will be lower. Therefore, the demand in those more scenic, picturesque areas will be higher as well. So as a consequence, you're seeing higher levels because of those mixture of factors.
Okay, so it doesn't mean the further west you go, the cheaper it gets. That's clearly
Not necessarily,
not the case.
no. Demographically speaking, Ireland has seen donatification. The Midlands areas are where you will see the greatest value to be got because the populations over the last 20 years have moved to the coastal districts. And those towns that have, those cities that have the higher populations will see the higher prices, and the areas that have smaller populations will see the smallest prices.
Okay, Healy, I'm going to stay with you. You deal with people every day. They're in your door looking for houses. I just mentioned about the deposit rates. Is that having a big impact at the moment?
In rural Ireland, it's less of a factor because we haven't hit that €220,000 cap. In areas where you do have that cap, it is a very significant factor. The city areas have seen higher rents. The supply hasn't come on stream as it should have had. So as a consequence, there's been no new supply of new building, which meant that the higher populations are competing for a fixed level of units. So the rents have been driven up. As the rents go up, your income has probably stayed the same. You've less disposable income available. So you're trying to save. You're trying to save with a more constricted income stream. On a broader spectrum, the rents themselves are effectively, they're up maybe 10% over a 20-year period, starting from the early 90s. So over a longer spectrum, the rents have begun to increase, but it's only really started to happen in the last 12, 18 months or so.
Okay. Tom, if I can come to you. I suppose traditionally our culture is you work for a number of years, you decide to get on the property market, and generally speaking, because of the cost of housing in Dublin, you tend to maybe buy like Naas, Portlaoise, down the country, okay? We've generally done that, but when I was talking to you earlier, there's a change in the behaviour of that. Would you just explain why? Why is that happening?
Well, I think what one is beginning to observe, and this is not only a phenomenon in Ireland, but it's observed right around the world, is that young generation, what they call the millennial generation, people who were born from 1980 on up to 2007 maybe, when they come to be adults, they tend to spend a good bit of their time in cities, and they get to like living in cities and want to stay living in cities. And therefore there's a kind of a move away from the suburbs and the exurbs to try and find accommodation in the cities. They're sacrificing cars, sacrificing accommodation, and what they're gaining is the kind of benefits you get from living in a city, which is accessibility to cultural facilities, no commute, accessibility to restaurants and entertainment. So what is being observed around the world is that your generation, people your age, are preferring to live in city centres. And I shouldn't say city centres, because when I say city, cities mean one thing to you. It's large urban areas, the larger urban areas, where they can access these sort of facilities. So you're finding this is what's happening. So that's driving up prices and rents in urban areas versus prices and rents down the country.
I just, even when I was talking to you earlier, you gave a very interesting proposition. You gave the example of if somebody has a contract job down the country, and we picked, for example, Thurles, which is a good way from the M50. If somebody has a contract job in Thurles, they should still perhaps consider buying, for example, in Lucan. Now, I asked some of my colleagues how far is it from the M50 to Thurles every day, and it's roughly about an hour and a half. So just, I suppose, Tom, explain the logic behind that.
Okay. The point is, I think, another feature of the millennial generation and employment now is that it tends to be less permanent than the generation that's past. Nowadays, people tend to get more contract employment. They're in precarious employment. Businesses are more precarious. So the net result of that is one can tend to want to look forward to a career where you'll be changing jobs quite a lot. And in those transitions from one job to another, your income might drop, and it might be difficult to find accommodation. Now, if you're living in a city, if you're living in Lucan, and you've got a couple living in the city and one loses their job, well, they could find a job along the M50 or in the Dublin area that they can access. Whereas if they're in Thurles, one person might be employed and the other person loses their job, it can be very, very difficult to find that replacement job in Thurles. So the net result of that is that your income goes down, and if you have borrowed loads and loads of money, your income is compromised. This puts your house at risk. So what people are tending to do now is look for houses at points of maximum accessibility, so that if you lose the job, well, you'll find another job in your catchment area. And that is reinforcing the tendency to want to come and live in places of high accessibility. It's better to put it that way rather than cities. It so happens that cities generally have places of high accessibility, but it doesn't have to be so. You could find some towns in Ireland are points of high accessibility and would offer people the opportunity, if they lose their job, to find employment within a reasonable commute. But certainly what's going to be the future is that if you're going to buy a house, think about the fact that 5-7 years down the road, you might be in one of those periods of your life where for a year or even more, you might not have an income. And what happens to your mortgage during that period?
Yeah, so everybody, all young people here, but just bear in mind the security of your jobs. A lot of jobs nowadays are contract based. They might be only 12 months. You don't know if you're going to be there for the following 12 months. If you buy a house in that town, you lose your job. You know, you're left with the house. You have to meet a repayment, and you might have to come to Dublin or go to a city to find another job. So just bear that in mind. It's a very good point made by Tom, and it's a behavioural change that's happening. And as he said, it's not just in Ireland but around the world. So when you do consider going about buying your house, you know, just bear that in mind. Tom, we have a lot of young people here, and I suppose the one thing that's on their mind, if they have to move to the cities, and I know you're probably familiar with Dublin, if they have to move to Dublin in the next, come next autumn, what type of rents will they have to pay?
Well, a rough guide on that would be anything from 500 to 700 or 800 euro per bed space. Rents in Dublin are particularly high at the moment, and they're also growing in Cork and Galway, and in fact Limerick and other areas, anywhere where there's a demand for accommodation, because an awful lot of, one other thing that's happening is that millennium generation, your generation, are prepared. First of all, they're not getting married until they're in their 30s. Yeah. They're not having children until they're in their mid-30s. So what they do between the years they leave college and finish their education at, say, 22, 23, and the date on which they get married, there's 10 years there, they're all quite happy to live in rented accommodation, and live in rented accommodation in highly accessible locations where they can get to the theatres, the restaurants, the cultural events they want to spend their leisure time at. So what you're seeing is that those who have income, spare income, are prepared to spend some of that on renting accommodation close to all those facilities, and perhaps not driving cars. There is in America now, there's an observable major fall-off in the interests of people your age driving cars. The numbers of people accessing licenses is going down. The number of people your age who are owning cars is going down. Your generation have fallen out of love of cars. My generation loved cars because it gave us freedom. Your generation accesses freedom by getting on a tram or a bus or walking or cycling to work and cycling to your leisure activities afterwards. It's a very, very different world.
Just Ciara, I'm going to come to you in a minute, but just Healy, you're based in Athlone, and you might be also familiar with Galway. Say some of these students here might have to go to Athlone or Galway. What is the rent situation there?
The rent situation has tightened up a lot in these centres. In Athlone particularly, there has been no building since 2007. So you're looking at effectively a decade with no construction that's going on. The rents overall from peak to trough would have dropped 150 euros a month maybe. So you would have been paying maybe 750 euros a month for a really good 2-bedroom apartment. That could have come down to, at its worst, maybe 550 euros. Those rents are back up to that kind of level now. The tenancies are also tending to be longer. In the early 2010s, 2011, tenants were looking for shorter and shorter and shorter leases. The vacancy periods are quite high, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of nervousness out there. So tenants were looking for month-to-month lettings, 6-month lettings, this kind of stuff. So as a consequence, there's a lot of churn. Tenants were moving from one apartment to the other and pricing landlords off against the other. He'll take it for less and this kind of thing. That has reversed completely. The tenants are now looking for longer leases, or 1-year leases, 2-year leases, 3-year leases, 4-year leases. So as a consequence, the tenants who are in situ are staying there. The landlords, by and large, are happy to have the tenants in residence. There was a lot of debate last year about 2-year rent reviews, 1-year rent reviews, that kind of stuff. It wasn't as big an issue until the press made it an issue, no offence. And then the landlords started going on saying, if I can't make a rent review, I want to make a rent review now, and made them aware and started getting into these 2-year rent review cycles. But up until then, landlords are just happy to have the place full. So what has happened anyway is that the tenants are staying on longer, the supply isn't coming on. Whereas you might have had one person viewing an apartment, 2 people viewing an apartment, now you could have 10. Okay. And the tenants are their references are more important, their employment, their ability to pay, all these kind of things are becoming massively significant factors, whereas they wouldn't have been as important maybe 2 years previously. So there's upward pressure on rents. The rents themselves are still shy of what would necessitate new stock coming on board. The property prices themselves are well shy of construction levels. So my opinion is you're not in places like Athlone and Mullingar and Galway less so because the prices will be higher, but you're not going to see any supply in those kind of areas for at least another 4 or 5 years.
Okay, good advice. Okay, Ciara, we're going to come to you. Now, Ciara is going to tell us her story. She's a prospective house buyer, trying to save money to buy a house. So, Ciara, just give us a little bit of background.
Yeah, surely. Yeah, I suppose I'm 31 now, and I've been working in the Farmers Journal for 8 years. I've been living in Dublin for 10 years, and we're currently living in Knockline, which, if you're not living in Dublin, it's about a 30-minute drive from the city, 25-30 minutes depending on traffic. Now, you were saying there about the young people that might not even be thinking about a mortgage. I mean, during my 20s, I didn't do the year travelling abroad, but we did go away, myself and my husband, for 4 months. We saw the world. And then I suppose when we got to about 27, 28, we decided, we were kind of at a crossroads. We either get married or we save for a house. But we couldn't afford to do both. So we decided that we were going to get married. Now, I don't regret any of these life decisions.
Might be a bit soon yet.
Yeah, it might be a bit soon to be regretting getting married to him. But the thing is, over that time, the market has definitely changed. I suppose not only has the situation changed in regards to how much now we have to save for a deposit, but we've really been impacted by rising rents. When we came back from travelling in 2011, we rented a 2-bed apartment in Terranure, and at the time it cost us 1,150 euros a month. We lived there for 4 years. We had 2 rent increases over that time. By the time we moved out, it was 1,450, and I looked at that apartment on DAF last night, and it was 1,650 to rent today.
For a 2-bed apartment?
For a 2-bed apartment. Currently, we're renting in Knockline. We've got our house is I love my house, and because we're going to be saving for a long time, I wanted somewhere that I could call my home for 2 or 3 years. Downstairs, the sitting room and kitchen. Upstairs, we have 2 bedrooms and a study because my husband works from home. But we're paying $16.50 in rent a month.
Okay.
And I suppose just that is the reality. You know, when I say that, people from the country, people outside of Dublin, not from the country, I'm from the country. People outside of Dublin go, oh my God, my friends in Cork think that is so much to be paying. I say to my friends in Dublin, and none of us bat an eyelid. You know, Tom was saying earlier about beds from bedrooms 500, 700 euros. My friend lives in a 3-bed house in Rathmines. He's paying 650 euros a month. The house overall, there's 3 of them living in the house. It's 1950 to rent the house overall. So it's kind of, and you know, Mary's over there. Mary's been looking for houses. We sit next to each other. We're constantly looking at daft. That is the reality we're faced with.
So all those young ones who are going to move to Dublin, we're not trying to frighten you or put you off. But Ciara is trying to save for a house, okay? I just want to get a bit of advice from Tom and from Healy. You've heard her situation. It's going to take her a long time to save. She has been saving, I believe, for a few years. What advice would you give her, Tom?
Keep saving. No, I mean, certainly, there will come a point when you will assemble the money for a deposit. The one thing I would suggest that you don't do is don't do what the generation preceding you did and got themselves into an awful lot of trouble doing, which was to extend themselves to the nth degree to buy the house. Because the change that's now there is that we are in a period of deflation. So when you take out a mortgage, you will have that mortgage for 30 years. 10, 15 years ago, we had rates of inflation that were even 2 or 3 or 4% and higher prior to that. So inflation took care of the mortgage to a great extent. What's looking like happening now is that the mortgage will not be deflated or inflated away, and the real level of that debt will remain for a long time to come. So that means that you should be far more cautious in your approach to taking on debt than people a generation ago were.
Okay. Healy, what advice would you give Ciara? She made a personal choice. I believe you were living in Navan before that. She made a personal choice to move back to Dublin. She didn't want the commute, but she's willing to pay that hefty rent. You know, what sort of advice would you give her? Like, how could she possibly speed up the process?
Bar winning the lottery, I don't really know what else she can do. Like, it is a lifestyle choice. The question is lifestyle. You've made your lifestyle choice. You have a home that you're happy with. You have a job that you're happy with, and are you looking to save based upon those particular metrics? And short of winning the lottery, something else will have to give for you to, logically, to make more money in the interim. Either you move home, change job, try and get flexi time in another town, or your husband, if he works from home, possibly 2 parties working from home. It's about the concentration of population, as has been raised on a number of different occasions. And where you have high density populations, you have higher renting, you have higher competition for places. With the same level of income that's coming in, and you're looking to save on rents, moving to towns where there's lower rental levels, or identifying opportunities where that can be done, seeing if you could work from home 2 or 3 days a week if your husband works from home, and moving to places where maybe their gracious employers would allow you to send your articles in from Athlone. I'm very happy to sell you the house down here.
It is interesting. It is interesting in regards to it being a lifestyle decision, because, as Shirley said, for a while we lived down in Navan, and you know, we were getting up early, we were commuting, we were getting stuck in traffic jams in Blanchardstown, we were getting home late. All our friends lived in Dublin, so you know, we were missing out on that kind of time during the weekends. And yeah, there is a price to be paid for it, but I do feel like, you know, I felt lonely, actually. I was away from people.
Right.
It was very, you know, it was, you know, when you're not from that area, it was definitely hard, you know, and definitely, given the fact that we will be saving for so long, I'm looking at it going, it's going to be 3-4 years, and it's still, you'd have to live that during that time as well, you know.
Like there's a demographic change. It's been raised once or twice. There's demographic change is going on. Ireland has a history of home ownership and people buying their own homes. It's going back hundreds of years. The shift towards rental and long-term pattern rental is becoming more and more established. My personal feeling on it is that that's going to be an increasing trend in the marketplace. You're looking at more institutional block owners, block developers, and more long-term family rental situations, more continental type living situations going on. Whether or not that's a positive lifestyle choice, it's a positive direction for Irish society, is a completely different. It's a completely different conversation. If it's deemed not to be the way Ireland as a society wishes to go, we need to see regional investment going on. We need to see more industrial, more employment opportunities being developed outside of the major cities to counterbalance what's going on. But without action on a front that you don't control, then you are, in my opinion, going to see more lifestyle renters going on and a complete shift in the demographics of the country.
Tom, you wanted to come in there?
Just worth making the point that we did have, as Healy said, a very high level of home ownership in Ireland. But the reason for that wasn't only because, and it's a chicken and egg argument, wasn't only because Irish people like owning their own homes. What we did was we created the conditions through fairly high taxes and very large grants and subsidies to buy homes. So we gave people who wanted to buy their homes large grants, large subsidies, and we facilitated them doing that. And we could do that at the time because we had high levels of taxes in the 70s and 80s. If we live in a low tax environment where the government aren't garnering loads of money from the population because they're not collecting very high taxes, they don't have the money to subsidize home ownership. And you can do a graph and you can see that the high level of home ownership was correlated with high levels of grants and high levels of tax. We're into a different regime now, it looks like, and the government isn't prepared to subsidise home ownership anymore. And as a result of that, less people are going to be able to buy their own homes. And it is a sad fact there will be a lot of, probably you in the audience, who may never get to the point where they'll be able to buy their own homes, depending on your income.
And Shirley, if I could just go in on that, the whole thing of buying our own house, I know it is a traditional thing in Ireland to own your own house, but actually there are other factors that we are thinking. First of all, if we bought a house in the morning, if we had our deposit, we'd be paying less on a mortgage repayment than we would be on rent. And I went online last night to do the calculator. We'd be looking at $1,450 for a mortgage repayment on the house we're living in now, rather than rent of $1,650. And also, definitely, if we are to become a country with a better rental market, there has to be more structure in place. Last year, when we moved, we rented a place. And, we went in and we made our stamp on it and we made our home. And 3 months after we moved in, we got a phone call to say the landlord was selling and we had to get out. And we were back into looking for rental and everything like that. And there was nothing that we could do about it. There was nothing to protect us. That was the situation.
Absolutely. The problem there is that our rental market, the constructs behind it, the laws, the traditions and all that, were framed at a time when we'd owner occupancy, and that was the dominant tenure. The problem we have now is that there's a lot of people like yourself who are renting for longer and who want a degree of security of tenure, and the laws don't allow you to have that security of tenure, which makes renting a very unattractive proposition. But if you can't get the money together to buy a house, if you haven't got sufficient income, you're going to end up in that situation. So I think one of the tasks for the next generation is to have a look at the laws around renting and maybe adjust them more in favour of tenants, because certainly as they are at the present, you end up in that situation where you end up getting turfed out of your home at a time that's not of your suiting, and that's a real problem. The other side is that you buy your home, but the risk you're taking there is that if you've got the mortgage, a mortgage is a liability. You can get out of a rented house. You can just serve a notice from the landlord and you're gone if your economic circumstances change, if one of you lose the job. If you lose a job and you've got a mortgage, you still got the mortgage. And if you can't afford to pay the mortgage, the penalties start kicking in very quickly and you'll end up with negative equity. So there's a fundamental problem in our housing system as we have it at the present, and we need a big debate about that in Ireland.
Okay.
So from looking at the rental situation, just one final comment on that. Hearing what's been said about if you lose your job, you serve a notice of termination. If you're locked into a lease, you can't. You have to assign your lease. I'm not trying to contradict you at all, but what I'm saying is that if you are in those situations, you can claim rental allowances, those kind of things. But the similar protections aren't there for in mortgage situations. So you are right that something needs to be done, and a rebalancing. Like the rental market itself is changing radically. your landlord is what is deemed an accidental landlord. Probably somebody they lived in the home previously, they rented it out, they didn't intend to rent it, but all these kind of things. Those landlords will be gone in about 5 years' time. They're not going to be around. You're looking at institutional block landlords who are looking for tenants over a long-term period, steady rental income, investments, REITs, funds, all that kind of stuff. That's all coming in now. So the situation that you've been in will not be replicated in 10 years' time. The people you're sitting out here, the landlords that you're most likely going to be dealing with are going to be a completely different animal.
Okay, I'm afraid time is up. But I think one of the key messages was that when you do eventually go to buy your home, which I know is a long way down the road, strategically select your location. Because security of job is a big issue. A lot of jobs now are contract-based. You might not get a permanent position, and you buy a house in a town, and your job is gone. Where are you going to go? And with that, I'm afraid we've run out of time. I'd just like to thank my panel. I'd like to thank Ciara for telling us her story. Thank you very much, Tom Dunne from DIT for coming in, and thank you very much, Healy Hynes from REA Hynes in Athlone. Thank you very much.